Hello, my friends. Welcome to our Power is Within podcast. I'm your host, Chasmith, and my mission for this podcast is to inspire you to take your power back and realize that you're the healer that you have been looking for all along. If you're enjoying the content from this podcast and the guests that I've had on the show so far, there are a few ways that you can help continue to support future episodes. First, click the subscribe button so you have every new episode waiting for you each and every week. Secondly, if you feel I have earned it, you could leave a 5-star rating or a review on Apple Podcast. Another thing you can do is share your favorite episode with a friend on your social media. You can tag me at Our Power is Within. And lastly, at the bottom of the show notes, you will find a link directly to a tip jar where you can support if you do feel called to do so. So last week we talked a lot about shifting our perception in the interview I had with Tessa part 2. And so this week's challenge is going to be based around that. So the challenge is for you to sit with yourself and ask yourself, is there anywhere in my life that I can begin to shift my perception? And once you discover the answer, what steps can you take to begin to do just that? How can you support yourself through this shift? Are there tools that you need to use to help solidify this shift? Things to think about. And if you do feel called to share what you come up with, you know how to get in touch with me. You can email me, DM me, and of course, you can share it on your Facebook or your Instagram story and tag me so I can follow along. As far as our guest this week, I have Janice Thompson with us today. This is also fitting because if you did listen to last week's episode, we did touch quite a bit on the topic of grief and the heaviness that it can hold. And Janice is actually a grief coach, amongst many other things. And she has recently authored a book called Joy Beyond Grief, which will be released early in the new year. So be on the lookout for that. But Janice is here today to share with us her story. She has gone through 2 major losses in her life, and she shares with us what she has learned along the way, not only in her journey, but then what she's also observed and discovered through supporting many of her clients on their journey. Janice is a beautiful soul. She was a pleasure to chat with. She has so much wonderful insight to offer us. Support on the topic of grief. We talk about death and being able to actually hold space for and talk about death in our culture. And she gives us some wonderful tools for how we can find the support we need while we are in a grieving process, and how we can also be support for somebody else that is in a process of grieving themselves. She has so much wonderful insight into this topic. I know that there's some of you who are listening that this will probably really hit that heart center. I know it does for me. She gives us tools, and yeah, I think it's just a really great conversation. I think there's something in here for anybody who has gone through grieving process, who is going through the grieving process, or who wants to be a better friend to support somebody else who they know who is going through a grieving process. So I hope you enjoyed today's episode. All right, Janice, thank you so much for being here with me and everyone listening today on the podcast.
Hello, everybody.
So I wanted to just start out by saying I want to let all the listeners know that Janice is a coach, but she's also actually a published author. She has a book out called Joy Beyond Grief. Is that correct?
Yep, that's correct. That's the name of the book.
I'm sure we will get into that today and talk about that as we are going along. But I thought maybe we could take a starting point and have you actually share a little bit about yourself and your own kind of journey that you've been on and what led you into doing the work that you're doing today, into writing a book about grief and all that good stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's been it has been a journey, and I think that's what's really important to sort of emphasize with this. So my journey sort of started when I was, well, when I was born, obviously, but my journey into looking at what's happened through grief started when I was 14. And, quite a happy childhood, everything just going okay. I'd got an older brother, mum and dad, lived in a nice house, and, it's just an average growing up time. And at 14 years old, my dad become ill with lung cancer. And at 14, of course, like a lot of 14-year-olds, you think you're very grown up and you're an adult, but actually, really, we're quite young at that age still. And I didn't really understand the concept of cancer at that time. And although he was really quite poorly, I just never really thought that, I just presumed everything was going to be all right. And gradually, my father got iller and iller, and eventually passed away at home, thankfully, with the family around. But it was such a shock to me. I just really, truly thought he was going to get better. And I always find it amazing when I take my mind back to seeing him laying in the bed. I could see that he's clearly ill, but at the age of 14, I just didn't see that. I just thought everything was going to be all right. So, although to some family members it was, it wasn't a shock, to me it was a massive shock. So, I experienced that loss at 14, and I remember writing in my diary, worst day of my life. And from that day forward, everything changed. My mum, who was a character in herself, just really closed in, and everything become about her losing her husband. I mean, my brother was sort of left to fend for ourselves a little bit, really. At school, I suddenly started becoming quite naughty, and no teachers really put two and two together and thought, oh, there's something, related to her loss. And we just left to get on with it. And we sort of did, and I sort of grew up, and it wasn't until I got married when I was 21 and had my first daughter then, and my daughter Francesca. And all of a sudden, there was a dad around again. And everyone was saying, it'd be like, oh, where's your dad, Fran, to the little baby and that. And I suddenly kept hearing this dad again. And I got very triggered, and I'd become quite poorly. I'd become quite depressed. It was sort of diagnosed as postnatal depression, but I knew it was more than that. And again, eventually, I sort of started to get over that. And I've always been into my fitness, so I carried on doing a lot of running, which I love, which helped. And then at the age of 35, my Francesca was now 14 years old, and I had another daughter then as well, an 8-year-old Jasmine. And at the age of 35, I'd been to one of my classes, and I come home, and my little daughter come running in from the back garden saying, oh, daddy's collapsed. So I went outside, so I was messing about again. And of course he wasn't. He had had a massive heart attack and literally died there and then. So there was no goodbyes, no chance for, to say anything, I love you or anything. It was a really difficult time. And for my daughters as well, and all the family around me. I was very lucky because I had a lot of emotional support from family. A lot of people aren't that lucky, but it was a really challenging time. And I've now know that really what transpired after that was what's often known as complicated grief. It was a grief on top of an unresolved grief from when I was 14 years old. So it was a really traumatic time, and actually, I probably went straight back to acting like a 14-year-old. I was doing some really silly things when I was actually a mother of two children, but again, luckily, I had family around me that helped support them. And that's what led me onto my spiritual path. That led me onto the work that I do now, in helping people to understand what grief is, to spread the word about talking about death, because we don't as a society, and to help people be less scared as well. So that's sort of how I got into my work. So yes, it was all quite traumatic, I must say.
Wow. Yeah,
Yeah.
to say
Yeah.
the least.
Yes. Yes.
And
Yeah.
could you maybe, I think this is a really great topic to kind of dive into, because like you just said, I don't know, it's something that I do wonder how many people have the actual, like, really feel confident that they have the tools to process and handle heavy grief in a really, helpful, productive way.
Yeah.
And you mentioned something that it was like complicated grief. Is that what you called it? Complicated?
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah, from
absolutely.
unresolved grief on top of, like, so
Mm,
grief on top of grief that was never truly resolved.
mm.
Could you, like, talk a little bit more about that for anyone listening? And then maybe even you mentioned that you've almost started acting like a 14-year-old again. And what would that look like?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, what I've come to learn since, and I think it really does help to, I'm always torn a little bit with labels. Sometimes I think they're helpful and sometimes I don't. But actually, for a lot of people, it's quite helpful to know that, I seem to go into a big reaction with the grief that lasted a very long time. And everybody's grief's individual. Let me say that definitely from the onset, but it was this grief on top of unresolved grief, and there's also grief on top of unresolved trauma. So there's a lot of, and there's at least sort of 15 different types of grief. So it's really helpful when I'm working with my clients and for people to understand that they may be in these other, be experiencing these other types of grief, and it can help them to realize that there's nothing wrong with them. It's really normal. And these things can help, having those labels sometimes. And you know and for me, I think, we're talking about how I started acting like a 14-year-old again. I sort of started rebelling again, which I definitely did at school when I was 14. I almost remember thinking, I can't look after my children because, I couldn't do it, And a lot of people, said, oh, you be strong for the children, you'll be all right because you've got the children. And to me, it was at that time, it was just, I can't do this. I can't look after my children. Just in so much trauma myself. I couldn't sort of see the wood for the trees. And I definitely started drinking too much. That was my way of coping then. And just started acting quite irresponsible, really. And like I said, I was lucky that I had that emotional support, because emotional support is one of the foundation things to help people with grief. It's been shown that if we can have some sort of emotional support, whether that's family, friends, or even a therapist, somebody that's there to help with those emotions during that time, I think it's really, really important. And from then on in, I started to try and find ways to help myself, and I went through all sorts of different therapies and different modalities of healing. And to the stage now where I am a therapist and a trainer in several of those, which has really, really helped me to help other people as well. It's it's,
Right.
it's a journey.
Hmm. What are some ways that somebody can discern whether or not they've resolved grief or that they have unresolved grief? Because when you were
Yeah,
14, did you cry and feel like the emotions to the best that you could, when your father died? Or, I guess I'm just trying to get an idea of what somebody can use to understand it, like if they were actually resolved or
yeah.
not.
Really, really, really good question. At 14, I was emotional. Yeah, I definitely, I've always been a very emotional person. I'm a Piscean, a strong water sign who's full of emotion. So for me personally, it wasn't, there was emotional outpourings, but there wasn't that sort of emotional support that helped me to understand what was going on. Um, but for somebody who's experiencing grief, the one thing that's really important to understand is grief is a natural process. It's a natural process. And if you've loved, you're going to grieve. Yeah, but if you've loved and you've lost, you are going to grieve. Now, whether that's grieving in an open way, like it was for me at 14, and definitely for me at 35, displaying your emotions or suppressing and holding them in, because a lot of society teaches us, particularly here in England, stiff upper lip, keep going, carry on, we've got to get over this, which is some crazy talk around grief, because everyone's experiences is different and can last different lengths of time. So, everyone's individual. So it's really important to understand that some people's grieving experiences may be longer than others, but it's also important to know that if you still feel the intensity of the rawness of grief, say a couple of years plus down the line, there may be something stuck. And that's the sort of way I described it. I had sort of stuck grief, and it was working through those stuck emotions, whichever way you sort of want to look at it there. But it's working through those emotions, working through that stuckness, that can help people come out the other side and carry on with their grieving process without getting stuck along the way, because a lot of people do get stuck along the way in their grieving process. I think it's quite an interesting little. I always say this. If I don't know if any of the listeners know, sometimes when you go to a funeral of somebody you don't know that well, and you get really, really over emotional about it. Yeah, you don't really know them that well, but you seem to just have these massive outpourings of emotions. It's probably because you've got some internal stuck grief that could do with helping shift through to carry on your natural process. And that's something that I feel really strongly about helping people with. There's an old Zen proverb that I love, which says, pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional. Pain is inevitable. As I said, it's going to hurt if you lose somebody you love. But suffering, carrying on year after year, is not. It's not that you're particularly consciously chosen it, but it's something that if you don't clear or work through any stuck element of it, will continue. And I've worked with clients sort of 20, 30, 40, 50 years on from a loss that still feel really stuck in it. And another thing that one notices if somebody does get stuck within their grief is that they'll keep talking about it as if it's just happened. There's not, I can talk about my husband now in the beautiful memories we had when he was alive and the fun we had with my husband and my children. I can talk in those ways now. Somebody who'd be stuck in their grief would be really perhaps still focusing on the death or what happened, the trauma. So there is quite a big difference there. You can see it quite clearly, perhaps more so, as a therapist.
Yeah. Or what do you think about somebody who kind of just tends to not really even want to talk about the person or not
Yeah.
really reminisce in the memories of them because it's too hard? That's probably an indicator that there's some stuckness, isn't there?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's,
Yeah.
that is a common theme as well, where people, don't show their emotions, don't want to talk about it. I've worked with clients as well where, people just are so shut down from it that, they just do not want to engage in talking about their loss at all. So that's another, indication that something may be sort of stuck, as I say.
Hmm. Can somebody, in your experience from, having dealt with so many different people who've gone through this and
Yeah.
yourself, can somebody still have like a level of stuck grief, like repressed emotions, but yet felt like they really cried and felt a lot during the experience? Like, I've heard this, like, oh, I cried for weeks and months and it was really hard, but maybe if they didn't have a way of processing those emotions with somebody or the right way, could they still then feel the heaviness of the grief years later?
Again, another very good question. Thank you. I think that they can. I think that people can feel that they've expressed a lot of emotion by crying and perhaps doing a lot of talking. And traditionally, there's a lot of talking therapies which work wonderfully for some people, not so wonderfully for others. That that re-traumatizing almost can keep occurring. But actually, when we talk about somebody that, say, feels that they've cried through their grief and feel that they've moved on from it. Some people do, and they have moved on. And some people, what's interesting is that perhaps years later, other things turn up. So I get a lot of clients, perhaps with physical things, that actually, when we look at what's gone on, we actually go back to that grief, and there's aspects or elements of their grief that have got stuck that they didn't realize. And I think what's really important here is we don't come into grief as a blank slate. We don't come into grief. I didn't come into, even when I lost my father at 14, I didn't come into that loss as a blank slate where I was just had nothing else going on in my life. I come into that loss with perhaps my mum being quite a controlling person. So that element, was within my life, nothing drastic, but there were certain things. And I think it's the same for everybody. We don't come into grief as a blank slate. Now, towards the end of the interview, I'd like to perhaps talk about the more transformative nature of grief. But just at this point here, it's really important to see that actually so many people weave their patterns through their grieving experience. So and I think often the sort of simplest way to explain that is if someone's had a lot of anger in their life due to trauma or whatever circumstances their life has been, and they do experience a lot of anger, actually that will come out within their grieving experience. And that's what makes everybody's grief individual. So that individual may be just really angry about their loss, angry at God or angry at doctors, whatever happened, or angry at themselves because they should have done something. So often what happens through your grief, is a reflection of different patterns that you've experienced in your life. And that does have a transformative aspect to it. But it's something that I think is really quite important, to sort of see.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And also, I was going to say another big thing that shows up a lot with grief is guilt.
Absolutely. Guilt is enormous. And sort of guilt or blame, is it it's somebody else's fault, or I should have done this, I should have, would have, could have. And from my experience, I think the guilt comes about because of our lack as a society of speaking and understanding death on one hand, but also because we can't really explain what's happened. It's something out of our control. This person's died either from an illness or suicide, or like my partner, a sudden heart attack, and we can't make sense of it. Why did this happen? Why has this happened to me? What's happened here? So because people can't make sense of it, because nobody 100% is sure about what happens with death, that because they can't make sense of it, they often turn it inwards. Oh, if only I had done this, if only I'd said that, I should have done this, I should have done that. If only I hadn't done this, then this person may still be alive. So I think guilt comes out of that. Again, that fear, that not understanding death, and a lot of society's, ways of really being so fearful about death, which is very different to a lot of perhaps more like, for example, like Native Americans or Aboriginals idea of loss and death. So I think it's really important those things like guilt are looked at. And again, I've worked with clients that the guilt's just eaten away at them, bless them, and it's really hard, but it can be worked through and understood.
Mm-hmm.
But
There's
it
hope.
is huge. Yeah, absolutely, definitely.
When you were a child, at any point, let's just say prior to your husband dying at 35,
Yeah.
Was there any point after 14 that you would have been able to consciously be aware of the fact that you had unresolved grief, or was this just kind of in the background and not actually known to you?
Interesting. I think it was really good, really good. I think I knew things weren't all right. I think I knew that I didn't feel all right. You know, it was that classic. One minute everything was lovely, the family playing and going out with my friends, and the next minute, boom, my dad had gone and everything changed. um, and everything does change. There's this ripple out effect, these secondary losses that you get. People acted differently with me, and I think so. I knew that I wasn't all right. I knew that I wasn't all right. I was acting, really angry at school, and I really was struggling. I had a couple of teachers that were absolutely angels. They really, really helped me. But a lot of the teachers and that didn't understand what was going on. But I definitely was very angry for a while, a long while. And I think, again, like I said, it really did show up when I had my daughter, and that word dad was about. And I think if I'd have had more help then with the types of energy techniques I use now, I would have understood why that was really pulling on me so much. Although talking now, of course, it seems obvious, but at the time, it didn't. I didn't. Those little connections didn't connect.
Hmm.
So.
At any point in your young adult life and into your, 20s and 30s, prior to your husband's death, did you ever like consciously feel or like reflect back and notice that you felt unsupported in some way, like that you didn't have the support to process it in a way that would be most serving for you?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Hmm.
I knew, I was really aware that I didn't have support.
Hmm.
It was interesting because at the time, my best friend, who's still we're very close still, um, her parents got divorced. So that's another loss. There's losses in lots of different ways. We're particularly talking about bereavement today, but I work with all sorts of losses. And her parents got divorced at the same time. So we sort of had this little, loss going on between us. So I got a lot of support from my friend. But I think my mother didn't really get the support. She didn't have the support to help her as a mother to bring up two children on her own. So she was sort of, paddling around in a pool on her own. And so she couldn't really have that ability to help me and my brother. A couple of family members did sort of step up and help. But I definitely was aware that I didn't have that support. And looking back, it sort of becomes clearer and clearer. I think things are a bit better. I do think there's an aspect of the sign of the times. I do think things are a lot better. I know that I've been into schools and talk about loss, and there's a lot of different avenues out there now where you can get support for different losses. So I think things are shifting and changing, but I think we need to really, you know, perhaps talk about death and not be so fearful of what that actually means. And I'm speaking sort of from a more spiritual aspect there.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, once you started being able to process your husband's death and um, find the support you needed and do the work that you were doing, what ways were you able to then go back and help support your daughters through their grieving process in a way that you weren't supported as a child?
Yeah, I mean, because we really, it's really important, isn't it? And as again, I sort of said, I do, from my perspective, working with energy, I often see patterns with people. And my dad died when I was 14. My daughter's dad died when she was 14. That was my husband. So to me, it was like, whoa, this is like And I remember my eldest daughter saying to me, is my husband going to die when, I have a child? And I said, no, because we did whatever, whether it's karma, whatever was going on with a pattern, I believe that I've worked through, and we've cleared that as a generational thing. But what happened after my husband died, I was very lucky because I had a wonderful GP, and I used to literally go to him every week. He was the doctor that came to my house when my husband died, and he was just such a wonderful man. I used to go and see him regular and sort of say, oh, I'm just not coping. And he'd say, well, why don't you try some antidepressants just to get you, over it, which really helped for some people. But for me, I just really didn't want to. So we'd have a little conversation, go away. Next week we'd come back and we'd say all the same things again. But it was a nice support. It really did help. And I did have some counselling at that point. But I started to look in different directions for help. So I had some Reiki, which was really helpful. And then I started to look at EFT, really helped me, and moving on from that matrix re-imprinting, which I do a lot now with a lot of my clients, both of which I'm a practitioner and trainer in for those. And I realized that, particularly the tapping for my girls, that actually we could sit down and tap, and those sort of things would be really helpful. And my eldest daughter developed what was diagnosed as vitiligo, so where you've got a discoloration of the skin, after my husband died, which, in theory shouldn't go away. But actually we did a lot of tapping around that. And that's often from a mental health point of view, which I look at the emotional understandings of trauma, how they show up in a physical way, was about, brutal separation. So for my daughter, that's what she experienced. But, we started doing the tapping. I used to do some colour work, and I just started integrating energy techniques, into their lives, and to help them through in that way. So it was really lovely a little bit further down the road, because it took me a while to get myself together to actually see that my girls had those, could use those simple, wonderful energy tools, of which there's a lot of different ones around. So they and ever since they've grown up now. My eldest daughter's got a little baby of her own, and things are very, very different for them than my experience. Definitely.
That's so wonderful that you were able to overcome the initial shock and where you were at initially, and then to get into finding tools and modalities that really supported you, that you could then give back and support them.
Yeah.
What a gift.
Yeah, no, absolutely a gift. And, and I really do feel that it is my sort of purpose now to help those grieving. Like I said, it is a natural process, but that doesn't mean to say that we can't support and help people through that natural process. Part of my background was a psychology researcher. And, I'm a bit of a research junkie. I'll often look at different researches, and, a lot of what's coming out with grief now is that, well, it's a natural process. So, we're resilient. That's it. Just let it be. But I don't agree with that. I think we all need support and help, in whatever ways that is, when we're going through a grieving process, because it hurts. It's very painful. It's really emotionally painful. And if we don't keep that process moving along, the stuckness can reflect years later.
Right. And show up in the physical.
And show up in the physical.
Yeah.
Massively. Massively.
What are some suggestions that you would give to anybody listening who has either recently or in their past experienced the heaviness of grief, and they might feel like they have some unresolved stuckness or some stuff they need to still work through? What advice could you give them, and what are some tips and tricks that they could do on their own to support themselves?
Yeah, I think initially, I think one thing that's quite helpful, and it's often the simple, obvious things. I said emotional support is really, really important, and I think because of our lack of talking about death, and there's a survey done not that long ago in England where it was found that 75% of the people that were asked didn't want to talk about death. So if you translate that to somebody who's lost somebody, there's going to be a lot of people around them that just don't know what to say, don't know how to act. Often comments are made quite flippantly that can be really hurtful for people. And I'm sure there's a lot of people listening to this that have experienced those sort of comments. Aren't you over this yet? Or, all sorts of comments. And I think what is quite helpful, if you find a friend or a family member that you can call, and I call them a grief buddy. If you can find somebody that becomes your grief buddy, then they sort of know their role as a supporter, and a dialogue can begin with what can be helpful. Yeah, so it might be some tapping, it might be some just sitting quietly, it might be just sitting with them while they have a cry and a reminisce, it might be all sorts of things. But often just allowing a friend or a family member to be called a grief buddy helps that person to feel, okay, I can do this, and we're going to work through this together, as opposed to just sort of reaching out to people that don't know what to say. So I think that's number one, if it's possible to do that, to find somebody that you can call your grief buddy, and they don't have to know the right things to say, but it's just somebody that you've got that support with. And then moving on as well from that, I think it's important to, if you feel that you're stuck, particularly, to get some sort of help from perhaps some, I would suggest, energy practitioners, because I think it's about stuck energy from my perspective. So if you can help clear that stuck energy, then you will just carry on that flowing of your natural process. So perhaps actually, engaging with a process. So tapping's great because you can learn, you can find out online or come to my website, or, the tapping you can just do yourself, just sitting and tapping without saying anything. You can get, you can tap from just literally sitting tapping to getting very involved and working through things with a practitioner. But actually the basic tapping can really help calm your system, and just tapping on just literally the feelings that you've got. I know you mentioned earlier my book. It's not complete, it's not out yet, but it will be out very soon. And within that, it'll be out very soon. But within that, there is like self-love exercises at the end of each chapter. So there's little exercises, just perhaps writing some answers to some questions, filling in a few little forms and things that can just help you to understand or have some clarity around your loss. Because I think the other thing, I know we mentioned guilt earlier, but another thing that can really come up with grief is we can't focus, we can't think straight, we get this sort of brain fog, especially in the rawness of grief. We just can't think straight. And talking about the power within, actually, if we can focus on one aspect of our loss, then we can feel more power and more control over ourselves and what's going on, which really helps that flow of that grieving process, because we often feel out of control. Things feel out of control when we lose a loved one. It's not something within our power to shift and change. So to help people feel more empowered within their grieving process can be really helpful. So a grieving buddy, simple tapping, energy techniques, and actually focusing on a couple of things. Being creative is another really helpful little tool. Being out in nature. Nature is such a supporter of grief. And also being in the moment. And I know there's a lot of banter and talk about being in the moment and staying in the moment. What does that mean? But, if you go out for a walk in nature, just to really focus on what's going on around you, look at that bird, look at that little animal moving around, the leaves moving. Those things can be really therapeutic in terms of of helping you with your grief, much more so than people, I think, realize. So there are definitely a few little things that can definitely help.
Yeah, I love that. I love how you pointed out because that is so true, and I never thought about it this way. That we can feel in a sense disempowered when we're experiencing loss because there's nothing we can do about it. We can't change it. That's such a good point. So
Yeah.
really having practices that do help us to realign to that power inside and that power within to help us come back to that center of empowerment is so important. And I never thought of that.
Yeah, and I agree. I think it is really, really important. And I think people sort of sense it in some way, but actually to name it and sort of say, actually feeling disempowered, it can be a really big part of your grief. So actually, how can we help you to feel more empowered? What is it that you've done in the past that has helped you personally to feel more empowered in life? Because maybe you could engage in something that can help, in this time of grief. So I think there's a lot of people that do feel disempowered, and I think that can often tie in with the guilt. If only I'd done this or said this, I've got no power to change it now. But actually,
Right.
work with the guilt as well. That helps with a sense of empowerment to work through that as well, and to feel that you've got some sort of control back again in your life is as you said, and I believe and agree with you that it's really, really important. Really important.
Yeah. And I have a question. So,
Yeah,
what about maybe you've experienced this like yourself or one of your clients has expressed this?
yeah.
Have you ever had where you or somebody is doing this work, this empowering work, you're tapping or you're doing energy healing, and though there was a heaviness to the grief, you're starting to feel lighter and you're starting to actually feel better. But then the guilt actually comes because there's all these cultural norms at the same time. So all of a sudden there's guilt like, oh my God, did I not care enough? I feel like I should still be grieving, but I actually am feeling settled or okay with this or accepting. And then guilt shows up as if you feel guilty for feeling better. Like you almost feel like you should be punished and not be allowed to feel better. Is that making any sense at all?
That's making a lot of sense. So it's making a lot of sense, and it's almost like different aspects that people go through, and they go through their individual one depending on what sort of patterns in their lives as well. So some people start to work through, some clients I work with start to work through their grief, and then guilt does kick in because actually I'm starting to feel better. And I mean that can happen within therapy or outside therapy, where actually we start to look at a lot of clients where they don't believe they can feel happy. It's not okay to be happy because then they're not respecting the person that they've lost, and that's a common theme that can happen. But it's to do with pain. It's to do with not clearing that pain. I almost look at it as pain is a barrier to one's heart intuition. And the more that the pain stays there, it's okay, it's going to be raw, it's going to hurt in the first instance, and it's just about getting through those early days. But if that pain stays there, it's almost like a barrier to your heart voice, that intuition. So it becomes a well, I can't be happy, and feeling guilty becomes a something that people need to keep to actually feel they're respecting the person that's died. And
Hmm.
although I understand it, it's not the healthiest way to move through a loss. And I've also had sort of almost the opposite there, where I've worked with a client who came to me who appeared not to be. She'd lost a grandson who was in his 20s, and a lot of the family members, this was about 5 6 years down the line, a lot of the family members were starting to what we call sort of integrate that loss into their lives. But this one lady could not integrate it, and she was distraught a lot of the time. She couldn't go out, and it was all guilt. And she was just, I just feel so guilty because I spoke to him on the phone, and there was a lot of guilt. Now, when we actually started working together, we actually didn't really go to the loss, and we actually ended up about 3 sessions going to different times in her life when she felt so guilty. She was of a sort of era where it wasn't okay to sort of go out with a gentleman, late at night and different things, and she'd got a lot of guilt with different things that had happened in her life. And as we cleared those guilts from other aspects of her life, her grieving process just started to flow again. And she said to me, she said, something feels different about my loss now. And she spoke to me several weeks later saying, oh, I can go to his grave now. I feel more able to do that. I'm getting more involved in, they set up a yearly football tournament. I can get involved in that now. And I'm also going out a lot more than I ever did. So, there's so many different aspects to this that I find really, really interesting, really interesting. Lots
Yeah,
of
that's so
aspects.
interesting. And
Yeah,
that's like a really great example, like you were saying earlier, about our patterns showing up in our grieving process, our other life
absolutely.
patterns.
Absolutely.
Yes.
And
Wow.
sort of on the other sort of end of sort of on the opposite side of that, I worked with a client that when she was about 5, she lost her baby brother who was about 3, and her mum blamed her. Now, she wasn't even with her baby brother at the time, but he died, and her mum said it was your fault. Now, I didn't see this lady, so that happened when she was about 4 or 5. I saw this lady when she was 60, and she came to me because things weren't okay, and she got chronic back problems. And from the way I work, chronic back can often be about how you feel about yourself, particularly lower back, chronic back problems. So she, we chuckled about it now, and she always was really happy for me to share this story. But she said, the first time she saw me, she said, look, I don't, something happened in my past. I don't want to talk about that. We're not going there. I don't want to open that can of worms, but let's just work on my back. So we did a session or 2 sessions just with the pain of her back, and we worked through a few things. And then on the 3rd session, she came to me and she said, oh, I want to talk about something that happened in my childhood. And this is when this came out about losing her baby brother. So we did a beautiful session, and the way I work also is not only to help clear those patterns, not only to help shift and move through any stuckness with grief, but also perhaps to feel some connection to that part, that higher self, I would say, of that person they've lost. So she actually felt she had a lovely conversation with her baby brother, and also her mother, working in the sort of matrix that we do. And she said to me, thank you, I just feel really lighter. I feel so different. And this lady had got very chronic back problems. So, I wasn't particularly expecting that just to go away. But anyway, suffice to say, her back did start to get a little bit better. But the most interesting thing, and I love this about energy work particularly, is she phoned me up a little while later and she said, "Oh, you're never going to believe this," which I'm sure you've often heard people talking about when we hear these wonderful stories of how things change. You're never going to believe what happened. um, and
Yes.
yes, they're classics. They're classics, aren't they? So I thought, oh no, what happened? And bearing in mind, this lady was 60 and her mother was still alive, 80, and she sort of helped look after her mother, although their relationship was still very frosty. She said, I'm feeling so much lighter about my baby brother, and I feel like I've had this connection with him, and things have just really resolved. But she said the funniest thing, I couldn't believe it. I went round to mother's to help her, bring her shopping and that. And she said, my mother put her hand on my knee, which she never touches me, she said, and she said, you do know I love you, don't you? And she said she hadn't said that throughout her whole life to her. And to me, that is the beauty of working with energy, because it ripples out. It didn't only help my client, but it rippled out to showing that love connection between her and her mother that had just been challenged by stuckness, I would say. So that was just a beautiful story.
Wow.
She always says, please share, because, that had not happened with her and her mother. And since then, they've changed their relationship, all from that loss.
That's, yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah. Yeah, and I love that.
Um, yeah, thank you for sharing. That is really awesome. What you brought it up earlier. You said you'd love to get into chatting about the transformative nature of grief. What do you mean by that? And can you share a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, my book is called Joy Beyond Grief. And, in the rawness of grief, it's not the time to perhaps think about this. So if anybody is listening that is in, the rawness of grief, grief is very, recent to them. This is perhaps not the time to sort of engage with this, but just perhaps hear it, and it may be something for the future. But actually, if somebody is a little bit further down the line and have done some work to, keep their natural grief flowing, their experience of grief just moving along, then actually we can start to understand and see that there are what some people would describe as gifts within grief. There are actually things that come out of grief that can shift and change the way our life path we thought was going on can be very different and in a positive way. And I truly believe that about myself. So I'll give myself as that first example. When my husband died, I was a personal trainer. I had my own personal training business, which was very successful, and I loved it. But I wasn't really engaged in my understanding, for me, of my own personal spiritual journey. I sort of lost that along the line when I was very little, I think. And having lost my husband, of course, I would rather him still be here. That goes, I think, without saying. But I would not have gone down the roads that I've gone down that have helped me become truer to my connection with source, or whichever way people want to describe that. But with myself, I've had a massive self understanding, realizations in life, and I'm following the path now that really feels the path that is just the right thing for me to do. And we can never know, can we? But I don't believe I would have had this deeper understanding of humans, their connection, the universe, spirituality, if what had happened to my husband hadn't happened. So I think, there is that bigger picture that actually is always there, but we can start to perhaps understand it and learn that actually, if we use that massive energy within loss and grief, that massive energy of pain, to transform our lives and perhaps change and make things different for us, it is a beautiful way to honor and respect the person that has actually died. And I truly feel that personally for me, that actually, that now the path that I'm on is a beautiful honoring of my husband. And I can see that in so many clients and in so many different ways. People just realize old dreams that they had, that, they wanted to do this, and actually different doors open. As one door closes, another door opens. So, and seeing that actually there can be different, life is going to be different. There's just no two ways about that. But it doesn't mean to say it has to be worse. And I think with our understanding of in society often, that, oh, it's never going to be the same again. It won't be the same again, but it doesn't mean to say it has to be darker. It can actually be lighter. So I think it's something to consider, perhaps further down the line within your grieving experience.
Yes, I'm glad you brought that up. And it's so true. We can transform anything into gifts. It kind of just reminds me, a lot of my podcast often does focus on people with chronic pain or chronic illness, and people who have a long-standing chronic pain or illness can very much go through a personal grieving process, because you're grieving the loss of your old life, the loss of your identity, the loss of the self you knew. And so it's very much the same, that sometimes when you're in the thick of it and you're in that high level of pain, or you're really sick and down and out, it can be really hard to imagine that this could be a gift, and that good, beautiful things could come through it, and that someday on the other side you could look back and be grateful. But I've yet to talk to a single person who's got to that other side and not found the gift in it all.
No, absolutely. And I think, and I think, again, to reiterate, I think it's really important that there's so many different types of losses. Yeah, with chronic
Hmm.
pain, that like you say, that loss and with bereavement, that loss of old life, that what was my life, and that loss of identity. And, in times now,
Hmm.
with what's going on in the world now, loss of freedom, loss of security. There's so many different losses, but it's what we focus on, and I think that definite that understanding that there's a rawness, and then there's moving forward from that rawness, and it's in those times that we can actually see that there's actually a massive ability to transform our lives, and there can be gifts within that.
Yeah, absolutely. Although, like you said, in the middle, right when you're in it, that can be really hard
It
to.
can
If
be.
somebody says, "Can you trust that there's going to be a gift in this?" You could be like, no, what are you
No.
asking of me?" You
Absolutely.
know.
It's really important that it's in the timing. Yeah. I would
Hmm.
not suggest that with the clients that have just come through the door, that have recently been bereaved or had some form of loss. But it is something, and it's not for everybody as well. Some people, it's just fine to come to some sort of peace around their loss. That's fine. But for others, there's that beyond that. Um,
Hmm.
and it's individual, and it's really important that we respect individuals journeys. Really, I think that's really, really crucial.
Yeah, and because it's so individual, it's so important too, I think, for all of us, because like you had said, that 70+% of people don't actually want to talk about death, which can make it hard for people to find someone that they could feel supported by, and amongst that, sometimes it can be a tough subject, especially if, say, you have had death in your past and you might have unresolved grief that you're not aware of at the time. Then somebody else comes to you to talk about their grief. It could be very heavy for you to hold space for them, and we can often say the wrong things with good intentions. And I think that's like such an important reason why it's also good to just be aware of all this stuff, not only if you're going through grief, but then to know how you can show up for somebody else that is in it,
Yeah,
to know that, like, and also to know that you're not, like, there's nothing wrong with you, right? Because, like, like you said, everyone grieves so differently and for different amounts of time, but it can be easy sometimes when you're in it to feel like maybe there's something wrong with you, or what, other people say, "Oh, why aren't you over that?" And then you think, "Oh, there's something wrong with me. Why am I not over this?" When you don't have to be. It's like in your own time.
absolutely. And that is absolutely so important. And I am really passionate about this, and that's why with my own trainings I emphasize for practitioners to really look and work through their own grief. Not only if they want to specialize in working with grief, but anyway, because as a practitioner, you are going to experience clients with some sort of grief. It's going to happen. Yeah, we're all born, so we're all going to die. So that you're going to experience it at some point in your career if you're a practitioner, and particularly with that, I'm so passionate that you do that sort of work, and understand that grief, because it is such a big subject that if clients come to you and you haven't sort of moved through that yourself, you are going to get triggered. And of course, we don't want practitioners breaking down with clients because they've been triggered by other losses. So I think it's really important, and I think there's always that reflection of can I and almost, for some people, an almost easy way to see this is, I can talk about my husband's loss and I'm not breaking down. So therefore I have moved through something. If I was really crying still as we were talking, it's fine. It's certainly no judgment or anything. That's not what I'm talking about. But what I am saying is there's still something there that's hurting. So Can we help? Is it so? It might be that it's raw. It might be that actually something stuck. So what can we do to help? And that's why I think talking about death and understanding it, and if we could have a society that was more open and understanding and talking about death, that we could start removing some fears, because fear is a massive problem within death. Because if you're grieving, then often your own immortality, your own mortality rather, can actually come to the forefront, and that can be really fearful too. So another part of my passion is to help people to perhaps look at and understand death in different ways as well, which it can be
Mm-hmm.
challenging.
Some cultures they do.
Massively. Oh wow, boy, oh boy. Some cultures really celebrate. It's an absolute celebration.
Mm-hmm.
And there's so many different cultures with so many different ways of grieving. There's actually cultures still today around the world, small groups of people that actually that will have their dead relatives sitting there at the table before they bury them, to have a celebration with them. So that it's just something that perhaps in the West we're so not used to. Some are resumed after 5 years because they're mummified, and they have a little ceremony there again. So although they may sound really alien to us, particularly in the West, there are cultures that deal with loss and bereavement in such different ways. They see it more cyclical, like a tree, with the leaves falling, our autumn, our winter, see life in that way, which then in turn helps people to be less fearful, which then in turn helps with grieving.
Right. That's so interesting because that's such a testament to how powerful of an influence culture has on us, even when we would like to believe that we're removed from the influence. Like
Yeah.
I'm sure some people who are listening might resonate with this, like the thought that they don't let culture influence them, yet the truth is that it's so deeply ingrained and
Yeah,
so influential
I
in
think
ways that we probably don't even think about until you bring something up like this and you're like, "Oh, wow, this is such a testament to how influential it really is."
absolutely. It really truly is. Like, I mean, just going back to that, 75% of us don't want to talk about death. We just don't want to acknowledge it, and even we try and shut it out, often with the elderly going in care homes. And that's, again, this is not a judgment. My own mother went into a care home, but it's almost, we don't want to see death. We don't want to be around it. Whereas at different times in our own histories, we'd have the person that had died in our own parlour. It was called a parlour, where we used to lay the person out and attend to them as a family. We don't do that anymore. We're getting more and more removed from death, which
Mm.
I believe is having, like you said, we don't even realise, because we're not seeing that comparison. But we're getting more and more removed from death and dying, um, and that is definitely having a massive impact on our society, even if we're not realizing it as well, and definitely on our grief.
And I feel like the relationship that we have with death and dying plays a huge role in the relationship we have with living.
Absolutely, I think that's you're absolutely. I truly believe that too. You know, people can spend their whole lives worrying about dying, and
Mhm.
they're not living. So
Mhm.
so it is. And and I don't say that lightly, because there's a lot of people that do. Health anxiety is enormous in the world today. So I think if I could have a magic wand and wave it around a lot, I would be helping people to educate, and understand about death and the grieving process, that is a natural process that if we can go through it as smoothly as we possibly can. It's going to hurt, as I've said, but if we can go through it as smoothly as we can, I think part of that would be for us to talk more about death, and allow these conversations, such as we're having today, to be out there.
Yeah, absolutely. And hey, you're already doing it just one person at a time.
Absolutely, absolutely, and and like yourself, just trying to build those little communities. We actually have a little free online grief cafe. I don't know in America, but we have something in England called grief cafes, and they're very far and few between. Where actually you can go to a local cafe, and there'll be somebody like sort of leading it you can just have a conversation about grief and death and dying. And I'm doing one of those online at the moment. So you can bring your hot chocolate or your cake and tea, coffees and whatever, and just come along and talk about your own losses and things. And it's just a supportive little group. We do a little meditation. So, things like that I think are really helpful as well, to just get out there and allow people to start sharing and supporting each other, and
Hmm.
moving away from the fears around around death, and all those emotions
Right.
that are tied up within grief too.
Absolutely. So you have the grief cafe, but you've also mentioned EFT and something about some other energy work and something about matrix. I'm sorry. What
Yeah,
did you call
yeah.
it?
So EFT is as you know, emotional freedom technique. I know that
Yep.
you've had different people on speaking of that, which is beautiful, really gentle way of helping people through a natural process, because it's another natural thing that we're doing by just tapping. But also, moving on from that, I trained with a gentleman called Carl Dawson in Britain, who was one of the original EFT masters with Gary Craig, and he had a bit of an aha moment where he's developed something called matrix reimprinting, which has come out of his EFT work, and is a friend and colleague of mine now. And actually, he's a Hay House author, and I actually did a lot of the grief chapter in his book. And he developed matrix imprinting, which is again such a gentle way. It's almost like going into the going into aspects of the past where things perhaps weren't as comfortable in someone's loss, where we just help that, we call them echoes, um, that younger part of you to to cope and understand the grief, and to clear. It's almost like clearing those stuck emotions where they happen. So in my instance, it'd be like going back to that 14-year-old who saw her father, dead in the bed, sort of thing, and actually help at that point in space and time to clear any blocked emotions or feelings, and then actually maybe have that space to connect from a higher perspective with, in my case, my father, which I can't even begin to tell you how the stories around that, how people have really come to be at peace with their own losses and particular aspects, those particulars I should have, could have, wish I had, moments. So matrix imprinting is a wonderful tool for wonderful technique to really help with those grieving, those particular painful memories within grief. Really helpful.
That's awesome. And what else are you up to these days?
So these days, yes, doing lots of trainings. I'm an EFT and matrix reimprinting trainer, and I also do specialist trainings for practitioners around grief to help them feel more confident of looking at the different types of grief, and different ways of helping them to feel more confident within their own practice, whether they specialise in, as I said, in it or not. I've also just produced a little box of compassion cards, and I'm doing lots of stuff. But finishing just getting this book out, which is going to the printer soon, so that won't be long. And just really trying to spread the word about helping people through grief and talking about death.
Awesome. How can people connect with you?
They can connect with me via my website, which is www.janicethompson.co.uk, or you can email me hello@janicethompson.co.uk. Um, if you print my name in and grief, I should come up on Google as well. So, and again, please, anyone, feel free, therapists or anyone that's struggling with grief, because it's about share. And I don't I don't see that many private clients now, but I've got a lovely little group of wonderful therapists that do. So, please,
Awesome.
and even if it's just to have a chat, let's talk about grief. That's what I say.
Awesome. Do you have social media at all?
Yep, I've got a Facebook group called Joy Beyond Grief. So I have got an Instagram, but I'm not using that at the moment. Me and technology aren't best of friends. But yes, you can contact me for the Facebook page, Joy Beyond Grief. All work in progress, that is.
Perfect. And when should we expect your book release?
So that should be released in about January,
Oh,
February
that's
time.
right around the corner.
Yeah,
Okay.
won't be long now. Definitely not.
Awesome.
And that really is for people. It's like a book that you can just. My aim is to just have it on your grieving journey with you. To pick up, put down, perhaps pick up some of the little exercises and little tools and techniques that you can use to help yourself. So that is for everybody to help, hopefully.
Awesome. All right.
Brilliant.
Well, I just really wanted to say thank you and that I appreciate you being here and sharing your passions and your wisdom with everyone listening. And hopefully, this sparks something in the audience and, gives, people a sense of hope or some tools that they can use if they're going through grief. And maybe for anyone else who's not going through it, it does kind of inspire them to be more aware of how they show up around that topic, and then maybe they're able to then extend a hand and a shoulder and an ear for somebody else. So thank you.
Yeah, and thank you very much for all your wonderful work as well. Thank you, and I really appreciate the invite to be here. Thank you.
All right, guys and gals, that is it for today. As usual, you'll find all the links to connect with Janice in the show notes. And if you did enjoy today's episode and you know someone who might be experiencing grief who could benefit from the advice or information that Janice shared with us today, please make sure that you share this episode with your friend. And if you are able to show up for them and hold space in a way that does feel really supportive, because we do all really need that from each other. Don't forget about our challenge this week. Check in with yourself, see where you are ready for a perspective shift, and until next time, you know the drill. Make the week great.